The moment Alexander Stone stepped into the lecture hall, he never imagined that a single question from a brilliant student would unravel his carefully constructed world. The mahogany-paneled halls at Princeton University felt foreign beneath his Italian leather shoes. Alexander Stone, CEO of Stone Industries and worth over $3 billion, had reluctantly agreed to be a guest lecturer for the business department. His assistant had insisted it would be good for his public image, though Alexander suspected it was more about tax deductions than genuine philanthropy. The lecture hall buzzed with anticipation as students filed in, their eager faces illuminated by the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. Alexander adjusted his Armani tie and glanced at his Patek Philippe watch. 45 minutes, and he'd be back in his helicopter, soaring above the mundane concerns of academic life. Then she walked in. Sophia Martinez moved with quiet grace, her worn leather bag clutched tightly against her chest. While other students chattered loudly, she slipped into a seat in the third row, pulling out a notebook that had seen better days. Her dark hair caught the light as she bent over her page, already taking notes before he'd even begun speaking. "Good afternoon, class," Alexander began, his deep voice commanding immediate attention. "Today we'll discuss strategic acquisitions and market dominance." As he spoke about hostile takeovers and mergers, one hand remained raised throughout his presentation, Sophia's hand. Her questions were incisive, challenging his methods with an intelligence that surprised him. She questioned the ethics of his strategies, the human cost of his business decisions, and the responsibility of wealth. Each question cut deeper than the last, forcing him to defend practices he'd never questioned before. When the lecture ended, Alexander found himself lingering, watching as Sophia carefully packed her few belongings. What he saw in her eyes the following week would haunt him for the rest of his life, a depth of sorrow that no 20-year-old should carry. Alexander had returned to Princeton ostensibly to deliver another lecture, though he privately admitted he hoped to see the brilliant student again. He found Sophia sitting alone in the university's rose garden, her shoulders shaking with silent tears. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, but she seemed oblivious to the beauty surrounding her. "Are you all right?" Alexander approached cautiously, his usual confidence replaced by unexpected concern. Sophia quickly wiped her eyes, forcing a smile that didn't reach them. "I'm fine, Mr. Stone, just tired from studying." But Alexander had built his empire by reading people, and everything about her posture screamed distress. Her hands trembled as she clutched a crumpled tissue, and her usually perfect posture had collapsed inward as if she were trying to disappear. "Something's wrong," he pressed gently, settling onto the bench beside her. For a moment, they sat in silence, the scent of roses heavy in the air. Finally, her composure cracked. "My brother, he's in the hospital, and I can't. Bills are astronomical. They're going to transfer him to county care if I can't pay by tomorrow." Alexander's business instincts kicked in immediately, but something about her vulnerability made him pause. He'd solved countless problems with money, but this felt different, more personal. "I can help you, but I want something in return." The words left his mouth before he could stop them, and he watched her face change from hope to understanding to a resigned kind of desperation. The hospital's ultimatum arrived like a death sentence. Pay in full within 24 hours or lose her brother forever. Sophia stared at the official notice in her trembling hands, the stark white paper contrasting sharply with her tear-stained cheeks. The amount due seemed impossible. $47,000 for Miguel's continued care at the specialized neurological unit. Without it, her paralyzed brother would be transferred to an overcrowded county facility where his chances of recovery would plummet to nearly zero. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alexander Stone. "My offer stands. One night, that's all." The message felt like ice water in her veins, yet beneath her revulsion lay a terrible understanding. She'd grown up in East LA, where desperate choices were a daily reality. But she'd worked so hard to escape that world, to build something better through education and determination. Walking through the hospital corridors that evening, Sophia felt like she was moving through a nightmare. Miguel lay motionless in his bed, machines beeping rhythmically around him. At 19, he'd been her anchor after their parents died, her study partner, her confidant, her last connection to family. The accident had stolen his mobility but not his mind, and in his lucid moments, he begged her not to sacrifice her future for his care. But how could she explain that without him, she had no future worth preserving? Standing at his bedside, watching his chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance, Sophia made the hardest decision of her life. She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers and typed, "I'll come tonight." Then she kissed Miguel's forehead and whispered an apology he couldn't hear. Outside his room, she called her best friend Maria, her voice hollow. "If something happens to me, make sure Miguel knows I loved him." Nothing could have prepared Alexander for the moment he realized what he was about to destroy in the name of desire. The elevator to Alexander's Manhattan penthouse seemed to rise forever, each floor taking Sophia further from the life she'd known. When the doors opened into his sprawling apartment, she was struck by the cold elegance, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, abstract art worth more than most people's homes, and a silence that felt heavy with unspoken expectations. Alexander emerged from his study, his tie loosened and shirt sleeves rolled up. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the marble foyer. "You came," he said softly, and she heard surprise mixed with something that might have been regret. "I gave you my word," Sophia replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She'd worn her best dress, a simple black piece she'd bought for job interviews, and suddenly felt foolish for the effort. "The money will be transferred to the hospital within the hour," Alexander said, pulling out his phone. Sophia watched him tap out instructions to his bank, her brother's life hanging in the digital balance. When he looked up, she was already moving toward the hallway she assumed led to his bedroom, her movements mechanical and resigned. "Sophia, wait." His voice stopped her cold. She turned, and in the lamplight, he saw something that made his blood freeze, the careful composure of someone about to sacrifice everything they held sacred. In that moment, Alexander Stone, who had ruthlessly acquired companies and destroyed competitors without a second thought, realized he was about to commit an act that would haunt him forever. The young woman standing before him wasn't a business transaction or a conquest. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister. And despite her brave facade, she was terrified. The discovery that changed everything came in a whisper of honest confession that shattered Alexander's carefully constructed walls. "I've never—" Sophia's voice broke as she stood at the edge of Alexander's bedroom, her hands clenched at her sides. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither could cross back over. Alexander, who had been loosening his cufflinks, froze completely. In the soft glow of his bedroom's ambient lighting, he saw her clearly, not as the confident student who had challenged him in class, but as a young woman who had never known a man's touch, about to surrender her innocence for her brother's life. Something fundamental shifted in Alexander's chest, a sensation he hadn't felt since childhood. Guilt. Real, crushing guilt that made his expensive suit feel like a prison. He walked slowly to his dresser, retrieved his checkbook, and wrote out an amount that would cover not just Miguel's current bills, but months of future care. "Take this," he said, holding it out to her, "and go home." Sophia stared at the check, her eyes wide with confusion. "I don't understand. What about our agreement?" The words tasted bitter in her mouth. Alexander moved to his window, looking out at the city lights that had always represented his kingdom. "There is no agreement. I'm giving you this because it's right, not because I want something in return." He turned back to her, and for the first time in years, his expression held genuine warmth. "Tell me about yourself, Sophia. Really tell me, not as a business transaction, but as one human being to another." The unexpected kindness broke something loose in Sophia's chest, and the story came pouring out. Nights spent studying by hospital bedside lighting, working 3 jobs while maintaining her GPA, the crushing weight of responsibility that had aged her beyond her years. Her story unfolded like a tragic symphony, each note revealing depths of strength that left Alexander questioning everything he thought he knew about courage. Sophia settled onto Alexander's leather sofa, the check still clutched in her hands like a lifeline. The penthouse's warmth felt surreal after months of choosing between heating and textbooks. "My parents died 2 years ago," she began, her voice steady despite the pain that flickered across her features. "They were driving to see their old friend, someone from Dad's college days who had helped our family years before. It was raining, and a drunk driver ran a red light." Alexander poured himself a scotch, his hand surprisingly unsteady. Something about her story felt familiar, though he couldn't place why. "Miguel was in the back seat. The doctor said he was lucky to survive, but the spinal cord damage—" She paused, gathering strength. "He was going to be a physical therapist. He wanted to help people recover from injuries like his own. Now he can't even feed himself." The weight of her sacrifice hit Alexander like a physical blow. While he'd been debating which yacht to buy for his Mediterranean vacation, this young woman had been making impossible choices between her education and her brother's life. "The school fees are due next week," she continued. "I've already deferred twice. If I can't pay, they'll dismiss me from the program." "What are you studying?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew from her insightful questions during his lectures. "Business administration with a minor in social work. I want to create programs that help low-income families navigate healthcare systems." Her eyes lit up despite her exhaustion. "Too many people suffer because they don't understand their options or can't afford advocates." Alexander set down his glass, struck by the irony that this impoverished student had more genuine purpose than most of his wealthy acquaintances. Mrs. Victoria Stone's announcement landed like a corporate takeover, swift, merciless, and designed to eliminate any possibility of resistance. The next morning, Alexander's mother arrived at his penthouse unannounced, her Chanel suit and pearl necklace armor for the battle she was about to wage. "Alexander, darling," she said, settling into his dining room as if she owned it, "I've arranged everything with the Worthington family. Charlotte will make a perfect wife for you." Alexander nearly choked on his coffee. "Excuse me?" Victoria's smile could have frozen champagne. "You're 32, dear. It's time you married appropriately. Charlotte Worthington is educated, well-connected, and her father's shipping company would complement our portfolio beautifully." She slid a photograph across the table. A stunning blonde woman posed beside a yacht, her smile as calculated as a stock projection. "I'm not marrying someone I barely know for business purposes," Alexander said firmly. Her mother's laugh was like crystal breaking. "Don't be naive. Love is a luxury we can't afford. Your father understood this." The mention of his late father hit its intended mark, but Alexander had been thinking about love differently since meeting Sophia. "Actually, Mother, there is someone." The words surprised him as much as they did Victoria. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose dangerously. "Oh." Alexander thought of Sophia's courage, intelligence, and determination to create something meaningful with her life. "She's a student at Princeton, brilliant, kind, and unlike anyone I've ever met." Victoria's face went through several expressions before settling on aristocratic horror. "A student? Alexander, please tell me you're not serious about some gold-digging child." The dismissive tone ignited something protective in Alexander's chest. "She's not a child, and she's certainly not after my money." Charlotte Worthington's entrance into Stone Industries was like watching a hurricane in Louboutin heels destroy everything in its path. The elevator doors opened to reveal Charlotte Worthington in all her privileged fury. She strode into Alexander's executive offices wearing a white blazer that probably cost more than most people's cars, her platinum hair perfectly styled despite her obvious agitation. "Where is she?" Charlotte demanded, her voice carrying across the entire floor. Alexander looked up from his morning briefings, confused and increasingly annoyed. "Where is who, Charlotte?" But Charlotte was already stalking towards his secretary's desk, her heels clicking against the marble floors like gunshots. "The little tart you're obviously sleeping with," she snarled at Rebecca, his longtime secretary. "Pack your things. You're fired." Rebecca, a 55-year-old grandmother who had worked for the company for 15 years, stared in shock. "Charlotte, stop!" Alexander's voice cut through the office like ice.
But Charlotte was just getting started. She turned on the nearest junior executive, a young man fresh from Harvard Business School, and you, stop staring at my legs, you pervert. You're fired too. The entire office had gone silent, employees peeking over cubicle walls like prairie dogs sensing danger. Alexander rose from his desk, his fury building with each of Charlotte's pronouncements. She had just humiliated his staff, disrupted his business, and demonstrated exactly why he would rather die alone than marry her. "Charlotte, in my office, now." His tone brooked no argument. As they walked past his stunned employees, Alexander made a mental note to give Rebecca a substantial raise and a formal apology.
Inside his office, Charlotte's mask finally slipped. "Your mother said we were engaged," she said petulantly. "I was just establishing my territory." Alexander's response was swift and final. "We are not engaged. We never will be engaged. And if you ever speak to my employees like that again, I'll make sure every company in the city knows exactly what kind of person you are." The words that would change Alexander's relationship with his mother forever came tumbling out before he could stop them. Victoria Stone sat in Alexander's office later that afternoon, her disapproval radiating like heat from a furnace. Charlotte had already called her, spinning tales of Alexander's inappropriate infatuation with some mysterious university girl. "She's perfectly suitable," Victoria insisted, referring to Charlotte. "Her family has connections throughout Europe, and their shipping routes would expand our international presence significantly." "Mother, Charlotte just fired 2 of my employees because she thought I was sleeping with them. In what world is that behavior acceptable for the wife of a CEO?" Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "She was protecting her interests. It shows initiative." Alexander realized that his mother would never understand the difference between strength and cruelty, between confidence and entitlement. "I'm in love with someone else," he said simply. The words felt strange on his tongue. When had he fallen in love? But as soon as he spoke them, Alexander knew they were true. Somewhere between Sophia's challenging questions in his lecture and her quiet dignity in the face of impossible choices, she had captured something in him that he thought was dead. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally resigned curiosity. "Tell me about this girl," she said in the tone one might use to discuss a terminal diagnosis. Alexander found himself describing Sophia's intelligence, her strength, her determination to use her education to help others. He told his mother about the sacrifices she'd made for her brother, the job she worked to pay for school, the grace with which she handled poverty that would have broken lesser spirits. "She sounds very admirable," Victoria said carefully. "But Alexander, think about our position in society. Think about the family name. What will people say if you marry beneath your station?" The faded photograph in Sophia's worn wallet would unlock a secret that had been buried for 25 years. When Sophia arrived at Alexander's penthouse 3 days later to update him on Miguel's improving condition, she carried with her a small manila envelope. "I wanted to show you something," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "You've been so kind to us, and I realized I never properly told you about my family." She pulled out a creased photograph, its edges worn from handling. Alexander glanced at the image and froze completely. The photograph showed a young man in his 20s wearing a simple shirt and jeans, his arm around a woman who was clearly Sophia's mother. But it was the man's face that stopped Alexander's breath. He was looking at an exact replica of a photograph that had sat on his father's desk for 30 years. "That's my father, Roberto Martinez," Sophia said proudly. "This was taken just before I was born. He always said this was his favorite picture because Mom was pregnant with me." Alexander's hand shook as he reached for the photograph.
The resemblance was unmistakable. The same warm eyes, the same gentle smile that had looked out at him from his father's study every day of his childhood. "Sophia," Alexander said carefully, "what did your father do for work?" She smiled at the memory. He was a mechanic, but he was brilliant with numbers. He always said he could have been an accountant or a businessman, but he chose to work with his hands. He loved fixing things. Alexander felt the pieces clicking into place like tumblers in a luck. "Did he ever mention a friend named James Stone?" Sophia's eyes widened. James Stone was practically family to us. Dad always said Mr. Stone was his best friend from college and that he'd helped our family more than we could ever repay. They were supposed to meet again just before. Her voice trailed off as she realized what Alexander was suggesting. The story his father had told him 100 times suddenly became a living, breathing obligation that would redefine everything he knew about family. Alexander walked to his study and returned with a framed photograph, the twin of the one Sophia had shown him. "Your father saved my father's life," he said quietly, setting the frame on the coffee table between them. He settled back into his chair, the weight of family history settling on his shoulders like a mantle. "My father came from nothing. His parents died when he was 17, leaving him with debts and no way to pay for college. Roberto was his roommate, and when Dad was about to drop out, Roberto convinced him to stay. More than that, Roberto worked double shifts at the auto shop to help pay Dad's tuition." Alexander's voice grew thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "Dad always said that without Roberto Martinez, there would be no Stone Industries, no family fortune, no legacy." Sophia's hands covered her mouth as the implications sunk in. "They lost touch after college when Dad moved back to California to be near my grandmother. But your father never forgot. He tried to find Roberto for years, wanting to pay him back, to help him build something for his family." Alexander pulled out another photograph, his father as an older man holding a letter. "Dad wrote to him every year on Roberto's birthday, but the letters always came back undelivered. The night your parents died," Alexander continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "they were driving to meet my father. Dad had finally found Roberto through a private investigator. They were going to have dinner, introduce their families, and Dad was planning to offer Roberto a partnership in the company. The cruel irony hung between them like a sword. Instead, Dad got a call from the hospital. He never recovered from the guilt of that phone call. He died believing he'd failed his best friend. Victoria Stone's carefully constructed world of social hierarchies crumbled in the space of a single name that brought back 25 years of buried gratitude. When Alexander called his mother to the penthouse that evening, Victoria arrived expecting another argument about his unsuitable romantic choices. Instead, she found him sitting with a young woman whose quiet dignity reminded her of someone she couldn't quite place. "Mother," Alexander said as she entered, "I'd like you to meet Sophia Martinez, Roberto Martinez's daughter." The effect on Victoria was immediate and dramatic. Her purse slipped from her hands, and she grabbed the nearest chair for support. "Roberto?" she whispered, her voice cracking with decades of suppressed emotion. "Roberto Martinez?" Alexander nodded, watching as years of social pretense melted away from his mother's face. "Your father," Victoria said to Sophia, her voice thick with tears, "was the most selfless man I ever met besides my husband. When James was ready to give up on his dreams, Roberto wouldn't let him quit. He worked himself to exhaustion to keep your father in school." Victoria moved to the mantel where she kept family photographs, pulling out one Alexander had seen countless times but never truly understood. The picture showed his father as a young man with Roberto, both of them laughing outside what looked like a college dormitory.
James talked about Roberto every week for 25 years, Victoria continued. He used to say that everything we had, this penthouse, the company, our entire life, existed because one young man believed in friendship more than his own comfort. She turned to Sophia with tears streaming down her cheeks. Your father made my husband who he became, and by extension, he made our family who we are. Victoria walked slowly to Sophia and took her hands. My dear girl, you are not marrying beneath anything. You are Roberto Martinez's daughter, and that makes you family we've been searching for our entire lives. Victoria Stone's blessing transformed from reluctant acceptance to fierce protection in the span of a single afternoon that would reshape two families' destinies. The following Monday, Victoria Stone did something that sent shockwaves through New York's social elite. She personally called the society pages of every major newspaper to announce her son's engagement to Sophia Martinez. Not just an announcement, but a full-page spread detailing the Martinez family's history and their connection to the Stone legacy. Roberto Martinez was my husband's dearest friend and the man responsible for the Stone family fortune, Victoria told the journalists, her voice ringing with newfound purpose. His daughter Sophia represents everything we admire: intelligence, integrity, and the courage to create positive change in the world. The announcement included Sophia's academic achievements, her community service, and her plans to use her education to help underserved families navigate complex systems. But Victoria wasn't finished. She called an emergency meeting of the country club board, the charity foundation directors, and every social organization she'd been a part of for 30 years. Any family or organization that cannot welcome Sophia Martinez, she announced at each gathering, clearly doesn't understand the values that built this community. It was a masterclass in using social power for protection rather than exclusion. Alexander watched his mother's transformation with amazement. The woman who cared more about appearances than authenticity was now wielding her influence like a sword to defend the young woman she'd initially rejected. You realize what you're doing, he said to his mother as they reviewed the newspaper proofs. You're burning bridges with some very powerful families. Her smile was fierce. Darling, I'm not burning bridges. I'm revealing which people were never really our friends to begin with. Anyone who would reject Roberto Martinez's daughter doesn't deserve a place in our lives. She paused, looking at a photograph of Sophia and Alexander together. Besides, I've watched you these past weeks. You're happier than I've seen you since your father died. That's worth more than all the social connections in New York. Charlotte Worthington's fury at being publicly humiliated would drive her to orchestrate a scheme that revealed the true depths of her character. The society page's announcement hit Charlotte Worthington like a slap across her perfectly sculpted face. Her engagement to Alexander Stone had supposed to have been a done deal. Their mothers had been planning it for months, and Charlotte had already started shopping for wedding venues. Now, some nobody from California had stolen what should have been hers, and Charlotte's wounded pride demanded revenge. She called an emergency meeting with her closest allies, 3 other wealthy daughters who shared her sense of entitlement and her skill at social manipulation. We need to destroy her, Charlotte announced over champagne at their family's private club. Find out everything about this Sophia Martinez. There has to be something we can use. Within hours, Charlotte had hired a private investigator and begun spreading whispers throughout their social circle about Alexander's charity case fiancé. But whispers weren't enough. Charlotte wanted something definitive, something that would prove to Alexander and his mother that Sophia was exactly the kind of gold digger they should have expected. The plan she devised was simple, but devastating. framed Sophia for theft during a family gathering, creating a scandal that would force the Stones to end the engagement to protect their reputation. Charlotte's opportunity came when Victoria invited Sophia to a small dinner party to introduce her to family friends. The guest list was perfect: old money families who would spread any scandal like wildfire. Charlotte positioned herself strategically, waiting for the moment she could plant Victoria's antique sapphire bracelet in Sophia's purse. The bracelet was worth over $50,000 and had been in the Stone family for generations. Its theft would be both personally devastating and legally serious. As the evening progressed, Charlotte watched Sophia navigate conversations with grace and intelligence, her popularity with the guests only fueling her rage further. The moment Charlotte slipped the bracelet in Sophia's purse, she sealed her own fate in ways she could never have anticipated. The dinner party was winding down, and Charlotte saw her chance as Sophia excused herself to take a call from the hospital about Miguel's progress. Charlotte had been watching Sophia's movements all evening, noting when she set her purse down and where. The antique sapphire bracelet was already hidden in Charlotte's evening bag, waiting for the perfect moment. As Sophia stepped onto the terrace to speak privately with Miguel's doctor, Charlotte moved swiftly. The purse sat unattended on a side table near the coat closet. With practiced ease, Charlotte unzipped the worn leather bag and slipped the bracelet inside, nestling it between Sophia's wallet and a small pharmacy bottle. Probably medication for her brother, Charlotte thought with disgust. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charlotte announced as Sophia returned to the room, her voice carrying just the right note of distress. "I hate to interrupt, but my grandmother's bracelet has gone missing. It was here on the table just moments ago." The room fell silent as guests looked around uncertainly. Victoria's face went pale. She knew exactly which bracelet Charlotte meant. "I'm sure it just fell somewhere," Victoria said, but Charlotte was already moving toward the search. "We should check everywhere," Charlotte insisted, her eyes bright with anticipated triumph, "perhaps in purses, coat pockets." She made a show of checking her own bag first, then moved systematically around the room. When she reached Sophia's purse, her performance was Oscar-worthy. Surprise, confusion, and then dawning horror as she pulled out the sapphire bracelet. "Sophia!" Charlotte gasped, holding the jewelry up like evidence. "How did this get in your purse?" The room erupted in whispers and shocked gasps. But what Charlotte didn't know was that Alexander, suspicious of her motives from the moment she'd arrived, had been watching her all evening. And more importantly, Victoria had recently upgraded her home security system with high-definition cameras that covered every room. The security footage that would expose Charlotte's deception was already being reviewed by Alexander, even as she savored what she thought was her moment of triumph. "There has to be an explanation," Alexander said calmly, though inside he was furious, not at Sophia, but at Charlotte's obvious setup. He had watched Charlotte's movements all evening, noticed her hovering near Sophia's purse, seen the calculating look in her eyes. "Mother, don't you have security cameras?" Victoria's eyes lit up with understanding. "Of course. The new system was just installed last month." Charlotte's confident expression faltered slightly, but she pressed on. "Cameras won't change what we all just witnessed," she said, her voice pitched perfectly for the murmuring crowd. "The bracelet was in her purse." But Sophia, despite the humiliation burning in her cheeks, stood straighter. "I've never seen that bracelet before tonight. I would never steal from Mrs. Stone or anyone else." Alexander was already pulling out his phone, accessing the security system remotely. "Then you won't mind if we review the footage," he said to Charlotte, his tone dangerous. "In fact, why don't we all watch it together?" The color began draining from Charlotte's face as Alexander connected his phone to the room's large television screen.
The footage was crystal clear. They watched Charlotte arrive, greet guests, and position herself strategically throughout the evening. Then came the crucial moment. Sophia stepping outside to take her call, Charlotte looking around carefully, then moving swiftly to Sophia's purse and placing something inside. The timestamp showed this happening exactly 12 minutes before Charlotte announced the theft. "Well," Alexander said into the stunned silence, his voice like ice, "I think we have our explanation." Charlotte's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide her panic now. "That's not, the angle is wrong. You can't see what I was really doing." But her protest only made her guilt more obvious. Victoria stepped forward, her voice cutting through Charlotte's stammering. "What you were really doing, Miss Charlotte Worthington, was attempting to destroy an innocent woman's reputation through criminal fraud." Charlotte's public exposure would trigger a cascade of social and legal consequences that reached far beyond a single evening's humiliation. The silence in Victoria Stone's living room was deafening as the security footage played a second time, removing any possible doubt about Charlotte's guilt. The assembled guests, prominent figures in New York society, watched in shock as their social equal revealed herself to be capable of criminal deception. Charlotte's face had gone from pale to gray, her carefully constructed image crumbling with each replaying second. "I think," Victoria said with deadly calm, "that everyone should see this footage completely before drawing any conclusions." She was no longer the woman who had worried about social appearances. She was a mother protecting her son's happiness and a friend defending Roberto Martinez's daughter. The transformation was magnificent and terrifying. Alexander stepped forward, his business instincts taking over. "Charlotte, you have exactly 30 seconds to confess and apologize, or I'm calling the police." His voice carried the authority that had built a billion-dollar empire. "Attempted theft, fraud, conspiracy to commit a felony. I'm sure my lawyers can find several charges that apply." Charlotte's panic was now visible to everyone in the room. It wasn't supposed to," Charlotte started, then stopped, realizing that any explanation would only make things worse. The guests were already pulling out their phones, some calling their spouses to share the gossip, others discreetly filming Charlotte's meltdown. By morning, the story would be all over social media and society pages. Not the story Charlotte had planned, but one that would end her social standing permanently. Victoria moved to stand beside Sophia, her arm around the younger woman's shoulders in a gesture of unmistakable protection. "Miss Charlotte, you are no longer welcome in my home or at any event I attend. Furthermore, I will be personally informing every family in our social circle exactly what kind of person you've revealed yourself to be." In the aftermath of Charlotte's exposure, the Stone family's protective embrace of Sophia transformed from acceptance into celebration. 3 weeks after Charlotte's spectacular downfall, the Stone penthouse had transformed into wedding planning central. Victoria had thrown herself into the preparations with the same strategic brilliance she'd once used to build her real estate empire. The dining room table was covered with fabric swatches, invitation samples, and vendor portfolios from New York's most exclusive wedding planners. "I want this to be perfect," Victoria told Sophia as they reviewed flower arrangements. "Not because of what people will think, but because you deserve everything beautiful after all you've been through." Sophia, still adjusting to having someone else handle the details of her life, touched the silk samples with wondering fingers. She'd never imagined she'd have a wedding like this. She'd barely imagined she'd have a wedding at all. Miguel's recovery had accelerated dramatically with proper medical care, and he was now able to attend physical therapy sessions 3 times a week. Alexander had quietly arranged for him to be transferred to the city's best rehabilitation hospital, where specialists were cautiously optimistic about his long-term prognosis. "He's regaining some sensation in his legs," Sophia reported to Alexander as they met with the wedding planner. "The doctors say he might even walk again someday." The guest list had grown beyond anything Sophia had imagined, not just because of the Stone family's social connections, but because Victoria had insisted on inviting everyone who knew and loved Roberto Martinez.
Your father's memory deserves to be honored, Victoria explained. Every person whose life he touched should be there to celebrate his daughter's happiness. Alexander watched the women in his life plan his wedding and felt a contentment he'd never experienced. The merger he'd once dreaded had become something he eagerly anticipated, not joining two businesses, but finally bringing together two families that had been meant to be connected all along. The wedding day dawned with the kind of crystalline autumn clarity that seemed to promise new beginnings and fulfilled dreams. Central Park's Bethesda Fountain provided the backdrop for what society magazines would later call the wedding of the year, not because of its expense, but because of its heart. Golden October sunlight filtered through the changing leaves, casting everything in warm, honeyed light that made the gathered guests look like figures in a Renaissance painting. Sophia stood in the bridal suite at the Plaza Hotel, wearing Victoria's wedding dress, altered by New York's finest seamstresses, but retaining the elegant simplicity that had made Victoria Stone a young bride 35 years earlier. "Something old," Victoria murmured, as she fastened the pearl necklace that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother. Miguel, resplendent in his wheelchair wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo, served as the man to give her away, a role that brought tears to every eye in the room. The ceremony itself was intimate despite the crowd, 250 guests who represented not just wealth and influence, but genuine affection for the couple. Alexander's college roommate served as best man, while Maria, Sophia's friend from her early days in New York, stood as maid of honor. The officiant was the chaplain from Princeton University, the place where their love story had begun with a simple question in a lecture hall. As Miguel wheeled Sophia down the petal-strewn aisle, every guest rose to their feet, not out of social obligation, but out of genuine respect for the journey that had brought them all together. Alexander waited at the altar, his usual composure cracking as he saw his bride approaching. In that moment, surrounded by autumn beauty and the people who mattered most, he knew that every decision in his life had led him to this perfect day. When Sophia reached the altar and Miguel placed her hand in Alexander's, the young man whispered something that made both bride and groom smile through their tears. "Dad would be so proud of both of you." The ceremony that followed was a celebration not just of love found, but of family restored and friendships honored across generations. 5 years later, the Stone Foundation's annual gala had become the most anticipated charitable event in New York, not for its glamour, but for its results. Sophia Stone stood at the podium of the Grand Ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, her confidence radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from years of meaningful work. Behind her, a presentation screen showed the foundation's accomplishments. Over 10,000 families helped navigate healthcare systems, dozens of scholarship recipients who had graduated from top universities, and a new wing at the rehabilitation hospital where Miguel now works as a patient advocate. 5 years ago, Sophia began, her voice carrying easily across the packed ballroom. "I learned that love isn't just about finding someone who accepts you as you are. It's about finding someone who inspires you to become who you were meant to be." Alexander sat at the head table, watching his wife with the same wonder he'd felt on their wedding day. Beside him, Maria dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Her pride in her daughter-in-law was evident to everyone present. Miguel wheeled onto the stage to join his sister, his legs still weak but functional enough for him to stand briefly with the help of braces, a miracle the doctors had once thought impossible. The Martinez family learned something important from the Stones. Sometimes the family you're born into and the family you choose become the same family, and sometimes keeping a promise to a friend can change generations. The gala raised over $3 million that night, but more importantly, it celebrated the kind of love that transforms not just two people, but entire communities. As Alexander and Sophia danced their 5th wedding anniversary dance, surrounded by friends who had become family and family who had become friends, they knew that some fairy tales are worth the wait and worth every sacrifice that made them possible. The evening ended with Alexander and Sophia on their penthouse terrace, looking out over the city lights that once represented his kingdom, but now symbolized their shared mission to make the world a little better, one family at a time. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't asked that question in your lecture hall?" Sophia mused, her head resting on his shoulder. Alexander smiled, pulling his wife closer. "I think we would have found each other anyway. Some promises are bigger than the people who make them. They echo across time until they're finally kept.
And in the distance, the lights of the rehabilitation hospital where Miguel worked twinkled like stars, a testament to the power of love that extends far beyond romance to encompass the kind of family bonds that can heal the world. Thank you so much for reading The Billionaire's Heart, A Love Beyond Fortune. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming romance stories like this one. I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know, what was your favorite moment in Alexander and Sophia's love story? Which character touched your heart the most and why? Where are you watching or reading from? I love connecting with readers from all over the world. Your engagement means everything to me, and knowing where my stories are reaching helps me create content that resonates with readers everywhere. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time, keep believing in love that transforms lives.